Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Arita Goyal and I head the Microsoft Fabric practice at Exponentia.ai. Over the next 40 minutes, we will be discussing a challenge that comes up in virtually every data and AI conversation we have with enterprise leaders. The challenge is this: organizations are sitting on enormous amounts of data, but much of it is trapped in different systems, different business units, different platforms. And these were all the right decisions at the time, but have now collectively created an environment in which getting a clear, unified picture of the business is harder than it should be. We call this the data silo problem. While the term I'm sure is familiar to most of you, the cost is often underestimated. Not just in operational efficiency, but in strategic ability, decision quality, and the ability to unlock AI and advanced analytics at scale. Now, if you're watching this, chances are that you are somewhere in this reality. Perhaps you're a data leader trying to rationalize a fragmented architecture. Perhaps you're a Power BI developer who spends more time reconciling data than building insights. Or you're a business user who just wants to know why a straightforward report takes so long to produce. Whatever your starting point, today's conversation is designed to help you think through the path ahead. We'll explore why these silos emerge in the first place, what it takes to unify a data estate, and specifically how Microsoft Fabric is enabling organizations to address this challenge at enterprise scale. To guide us through this, I'm joined by Prathamesh Sable. He is our Microsoft Fabric Center of Excellence head. Prathamesh works with organizations across industries on exactly these challenges: designing unified data environments, leading data migrations, and helping enterprises get the most out of their investment in Microsoft Fabric. Prathamesh, welcome to the session.
Thank you, Arita. Really glad to be here. And I think your framing, you just set up, exactly that's right. This is a challenge that I encounter week in, week out, and it's one of the things that it's a real opportunity for organizations to move the needle significantly as we approach it, thoughtfully.
Perfect. So let's start by setting some context. Before we get into the discussion, could you give our viewers a sense of what the data landscape actually looks like for most of the organizations that you're working with today?
Sure. So when I walk into enterprise data environments, whether it's a large retailer, healthcare organization, or financial services firms, the picture tends to look similar in certain ways. So you typically look at a core data. You will typically find a core data warehouse, maybe a Synapse or legacy or on-premises system, which is in place for several years. And around that, you'll find a data lake that showed up more recently as a part of the cloud migrations. Then usually there are multiple BI platforms, Power BI in some of the organizations, perhaps Tableau or Click in the others. There may be a streaming layer that was introduced for a specific use case. Maybe a collection of ETL pipelines, some built in Azure Data Factory, or some older tools, maybe some bespoke Python scripts as well, that only one or two people might fully understand. Each of those decisions was reasonable at that time, but collectively they've created an architecture that is generally difficult to manage, govern, and scale. The immediate symptoms here are fairly recognizable. Reports takes long time to produce. Different teams produce different numbers for the same metrics. Data quality is inconsistent. And when the business asks for a new analytics capability, it takes longer to deliver than anyone would like, because the underlying architecture, it basically adds friction at every step. But the deeper issue is strategic, if I put it that way. So organizations that are operating in such fragmented state are essentially running their analytics infrastructure in the first gear. They're spending majority of the data team's capacity on integration, maintenance, reconciliation, rather than working like generating really the good insights and creating good value out of it. This is a landscape where into Microsoft Fabric, this is the issue where I would say Microsoft Fabric has arrived. And I think what makes Fabric generally different than others, it's not just a platform addition, but it's architecturally designed to eliminate that fragmentation. It brings data engineering, data warehousing, real-time analytics, data science, Power BI, everything into one single SaaS environment underpinned by data lake, a single logical data lake for the entire organization. The promise here is that instead of connecting collection of systems, you're operating from one unified environment, and the changes of need of the changes of what is possible, both in terms of operational efficiency or in terms of what you can build on top. So this is where Fabric addresses, and that's where I think it's very important to be honest about, this the journey from fragmented legacy environment to a unified Fabric estate. It's not a simple switch. It requires clear strategy, a well-defined architecture, uh, a sequence approach that delivers value without disrupting ongoing operations, and that's really the substance of what we are going to talk through today.
Great. That's a really rich picture, and I think it'll resonate with a lot of people who are watching this. Now, let's dig a bit deeper into this. And I encourage everyone watching to kind of keep their own environments in mind as we go ahead, because it will be directly relevant to your situation. Let me start here, Prathamesh. When you are working with data leaders, how often do you find that data silos and a fragmented architecture are actually the root cause of their problems around data insights and reporting, rather than just one symptom amongst many?
Very, very frequently. And what's interesting is how often it's not immediately obvious to the organization itself. Leaders will often find, they'll frame the problem as a reporting problem or a data quality problem or, speed to insight problem. This typically is what we have seen. And those things are real. But when you start pulling on the thread, asking where the data comes from, how it gets transformed, who owns it, which different teams consume it, you quickly arrive at, fragmentation as an underlying cause. Here is a specific pattern that I see regularly. Like an organization, for example, organization has 2 or 3 data streams, which each supporting different business unit, each running their own pipelines, they have their own data stores, there is no shared data layer. So when the business leader asks for a cross-functional view, say combining commercial performance data with operational performance data, it becomes a significant engineering project just to assemble the inputs. And by the time the report is produced, the data is already stale. Another pattern that I've seen is different teams, they have built their own definitions of core business metrics, revenue, customer count, churn rate. This should be, unambiguous, shared definitions. But in fragmented environments, it's common to find 3 or 4 versions of the same metrics being reported in different ways and by different teams as well. Now, this undermines the confidence in data across organizations, and once the confidence is erodes, it's genuinely hard to rebuild that confidence back. So, to directly answer your question, the root cause more often is not architectural; it's absence of a shared, governed, accessible data foundation. And until that foundation is enabled, you essentially are patching over structural problem with tactical fixes.
Right. So that's a really important distinction between, patching the systems or like putting a band-aid versus addressing the root cause or the underlying architecture. And I think this will connect directly to the next question of when and how enterprises should move to a unified platform. So for organizations that have recognized this fragmentation and have actually made the decision to move towards Microsoft Fabric, what does a well-executed transition or migration to Fabric actually look like? Because I imagine there's a significant difference between doing this thoughtfully and doing it badly, so to speak.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And and that difference that you spoke about determines whether the migration delivers on its promise or becomes another layer of complexity, of adding another complex environment. The first thing I would say is resist the temptation to migrate everything at once, which everyone calls it as big bang approach. Attempting everything from your entire data system, from your existing data estate into Fabric, into a single program. This is a big risk. You're asking the organization to change the data platform, the ways of working, the governance model, and the team structure, everything at the same time. The chances in this case, the disruption is very high, and you don't start seeing value until everything is done, which could maybe take 18 months, 2 years down the line, right? So the approach that typically works is a phased approach and a value-led approach. You start by setting up high priority workloads or identifying certain use cases, the ones that are most in pain, or ones that Fabric native approach would unlock most immediate value. You set up the Fabric environment correctly from day one, which means getting the architecture right, setting the one leg architecture, setting the workspace architecture, the governance framework, and the capacity model. Then you migrate the initial set of workloads, demonstrate the outcomes, and use that as a foundation for the next phase. What this does is basically two things. First, it de-risks the program. You are learning and adapting as you go, rather committing everything at upfront. Secondly, it creates visibility early, so which builds confidence in the leadership. It creates momentum in the data team as well. So subsequently, then the phases can progressively expand the coverage, bringing in additional workloads, decommissioning of legacy components as Fabric takes over their functions, and gradually shifting the organization's center of gravity towards a new platform. The organizations that execute this well typically have three things in common. First, they have a clear understanding and agreed target architecture. They have a strong executive sponsorship so that the decisions get made very quickly. And they have a delivery partner who has done this before, who can navigate the technical organization complexity and simultaneously.
I think this phased approach that you mentioned, it makes a lot of sense. Also, the point about getting the architecture right from day one, that's something I just want to explore a little bit further, because I think that's where a lot of organizations either get it right by investing the time upfront, or they end up paying for it later. Prathamesh, if you were advising a data leader who is about to kick off a Fabric migration, what are the top 3-4 critical foundations they must have in place before they begin?
Okay, that's an interesting question, Arita. So let me give you this thought process here. So there are 4 areas where I consistently come back to, and when any of them is underdeveloped, it's going in, it shows as a problem during delivery. So the first is your data estate visibility. Before you plan a migration, you need to understand what you are migrating. That means you have a clear map of your existing workloads, your pipelines, your data sources, your transformation logic, downstream dependencies. So in many organizations, this documentation either does not exist or it is out of date. So one of the first things that we do is a structured discovery exercise using automated tooling to extract all metadata and build in a clear picture of their current environment. You genuinely can't make good architecture decisions without unless you have this data. The second is your architecture definition. You need to agree on the shape of your Fabric environment before you even start building it. That includes your one leg structure and your workspace strategy. Your medallion architecture like bronze, silver, gold layer, your capacity, configuration on how your integrations will map into this new environment. These decisions have a long tail. Getting them wrong early creates expensive rework later on. The third thing is governance models. So governance and operating model, I would put it that way. So Fabric provides you powerful capabilities around data governance, access controls, sensitivity labels, data lineage, and endorsement as well. But the technology doesn't run by itself. You need to have a clear organization decision of who is going to own the data. Then you also have to think about who approves these new data sets as well as they come along. Then when we think about policies, how access policies are managed, how data quality standards are enforced. So this governance decision needs to be made before go live and should not be afterthought, which we have seen. And the fourth one is capacity planning. Fabric, as we all know, it runs on a capacity model wherein your sizing and capacity for your workloads is important for both performance as well as for cost management. You need to understand your expected query volumes, your data refresh patterns, your peak usage window, and your growth trajectory. The right sizing from the start avoids both performance and overspend over a period of time. So these are the common 4 things. Invest in time before your foundation is built. The organizations that do this will move faster once they start building, because they're not constantly stopping to resolve decisions that they were made earlier. The ones that skip, they find them in cycle of rework and erodes that moment of confidence over time.
That's very practical, and I think the theme of investing in the framing of foundation versus features is something that will resonate with our viewers. Let me now come to the other end of that journey, because ultimately all of this effort is done to get better business outcomes. So, for organizations that have done this well and that have gone through the transition thoughtfully and successfully unified their data estate on Fabric, what does the picture actually look like 6 or 12 months in? Like, what changes in a meaningful way? What are the key challenges that have been addressed?
Hmm. So the impact tends to be felt across three dimensions, and they compound on each other over a period of time. So the first one is operational simplification. So teams that were previously managing 4 or 5 separate platforms within their own maintenance cycle, security configuration, vendor relationship, cost structure, they move into one single governed environment. The overhead of running these data platforms itself reduces the cost significantly. So engineers spend less time in keeping these systems, up and running, more time, and they spend more time in building the things that matter to the business. The second is analytics agility. Because data engineering, data warehousing, reporting are deeply integrated within Fabric, the cycle time from data ingestion to business insights shortens dramatically. Now, new data sources can be onboarded faster, new reports can be built without first negotiating access across multiple systems, and because everyone's working off of the same underlying data in one lake, the reconciliation problem disappears as well. There is one version of truth and it's accessible for everyone who needs it. And then the third, in many ways, this is very strategically significant, which is the readiness for AI. That everybody is talking about AI these days, right? So this is the one that consistently surprises organizations the most, because it's not always a primary motivation for migration, but it ends up being a most valuable one. So here is a dynamic, if I talk about meaningful AI initiatives, whether it's Copilot experience in Power BI, predictive models, large-scale automations, they all require a well-governed, unified, high-quality data foundation. Organizations that have fragmented environments find it extremely difficult to find out or set up the AI part here, because set up AI use cases, because the data prerequisites are often not met. But once you've brought everything into Fabric, those prerequisites are already in place. So Fabric's native integration with Azure OpenAI Copilot capability, that means it's genuinely accessible rather than being aspirational. So the story isn't just consolidation for its own sake. The consolidation, it's basically a strategic enabler for everything that the organization that they want to do with data and AI.
I want to pick up on that AI point specifically, because I think it reframes the ROI conversation in a really important way. So when you're making the case internally for a Fabric migration, it's not just about reducing the cost of the current environment, but also about unlocking capabilities for what comes next.
Exactly. And that's the message that resonates very differently with the CEOs, CFOs, that we are going to reduce the technical debt. The consolidation story is very important internally for the data team. But the AI readiness story, the idea being unifying the data estate, is a prerequisite for executing your AI strategy. That is a conversation that lands at the board very well. And for the organizations that have AI as a strategic priority, it changes the business cases fundamentally.
Prathamesh, I think we've covered the technical dimensions very well. Now I want to ask you something that often doesn't get enough attention, and that is the people side of this change. So when you're migrating the data estate, you're also asking people to change how they work. And how significant is that, and how do the best organizations handle that?
It's more significant than most of the organizations anticipate going in. And it's genuinely one of the areas where migrations are either build long-term momentum, or they quietly stall after initial development. This is one thing that I have seen and experienced as well. So think about what's actually changing for a data engineer who has spent 3 years of building pipelines in a particular tool set, or a BI developer who knows every quick and turn of the existing reporting there, or data stewards who has built that data governance processes around the current tools that they use. So technical migration is one thing, but for these individuals, transition from Fabric represents a real change in their day-to-day working. If they are not brought along, as we look at the entire data migration strategy, we will end up with a modern platform to that people are very reluctant to adopt, and you don't really get the value you are expecting from them. The organizations that handle this well do a few things very consistently. One, they involve the data team early, not just recipients of a decision that has been made, but as participants in the architecture and the design process. When these data engineers who have been working on these systems, get a chance to have their input, how the new environment is structured, they are far more invested in making it work. And they also invest seriously in their enablement. Not like a one-day training session or sustained, but it should be a sustained capability building, hands-on workshop, access to the sandbox environment, dedicated time to upskill on Fabric. So Fabric is not difficult to learn, but people need space and support to make this transition with confidence. And one of the other things the organizations do is they establish visible internal champions. People within the data team who are genuinely enthusiastic to learn about this new platform, work on this new platform, and they can bring their colleagues along with them. Peer advocacy here is far more effective than top-down mandates when it comes on driving adoption. The organizations that shortcut the people side typically see adoption plateau, going down after go live. So teams revert to familiar tools, workarounds emerge, and the full potential of this new platform is never realized. It's worth investing in this dimension at the same time, having a seriousness at the technical architecture as well.
That's a really important dimension to have surfaced, and I think it's one that is oftentimes ignored. So I'm glad that we spoke about it. In fact, I think at times technology is the easier part to manage vis-a-vis the people change. I think we've covered a lot of ground today: the problem, the strategy, the foundations, the outcomes, and the people side. For our viewers who are now thinking about how to move ahead with this in their own organization, it would be great if you could walk us through how Exponentia.ai supports organizations on this journey.
All right, happy to do that. So our Microsoft Fabric Center of Excellence is basically structured to support organizations across the full arc of the data platform transition, like starting from the initial assessment all the way to a live scalable production environment. The first stage is assessment and discovery. Every engagement we take begins here, and it happens for a good reason, if I put it that way. Before we even recommend the approach, we want to understand the entire, the organization's current environment very clearly and very honestly. We use a combination of automated metadata extraction, structured architecture workshops to basically produce a data map, and wherein we cover the existing workloads, data flows, integration dependencies, governance gaps. From that, we develop a prioritized transition roadmap that identifies which workloads that we want to tackle first and why, and what the Fabric architecture should look like. So for many organizations, this assessment phase itself delivers a very significant value, because some people may know their environments or some people they don't, right? This will create complete visibility that the organization has been operating without, and it gives the leadership a concrete evidence-based foundation for making these investment decisions. Then the first stage is done on the assessment, the second stage is architecture, design and build. Now our Fabric architecture in Exponentia and data engineers design the target one lake architecture, implement the medallion layers, migrate the priority workloads, configure the governance controls, integrate Fabric within the organization's existing tooling, and identify the framework. We work in structured sprint with regular checkpoints, so the stakeholders are never surprised, and the direction stays aligned throughout. Third stage is enablement and scale. Our initial environment, once the initial environment is live, we support the organization by building the internal capability. This could be through tailored learning, setting up COE frameworks, and transfer of reusable accelerators and patterns that we have developed across multiple engagements. Our aim, is very clear. We are not to create dependency. So we want to leave the organization's teams to be better equipped to operate, govern, and evolve the platform on an ongoing basis. Obviously, we do provide support and maintenance as a part of this process as well. But our whole goal is to have a team enablement done. What I think that that differentiates our approach, that we bring data engineering, platform architecture, AI experience together into one single integrated team. We're not working with separate specialists for each component, having to have managed the migration by yourself. You get the end-to-end view from the people who have done this across multiple industries, and and at scale as well. So it's not just we have done it for small medium, we have worked on enterprise customers as well, where we understand how large scale migrations also take care of. And the practical implementation of that is faster time to value, because the coordination overhead is lower, the decisions are made with full context, and the team designs the architecture, and it's the same team that builds and validates it as well.
Great. Now, that's a really clear picture of the journey. And for anyone watching who'd like to explore what this might look like for their organization, the details of how to get in touch with our team are at the end of this discussion, and we would welcome the conversation. We're coming to the end of today's session, and I just want to close with a thought that I think captures the core message of everything we've discussed. And that's that data silos are not just a technical inconvenience. They are a quite compounding constraint on an organization's ability to grow, adapt, and compete. Every day that fragmented architecture remains in place, the cost accumulates in the form of wasted capacity, missed insights, slow decisions, and the widening gap between where the organization is and where it wants to be with its data and AI. Microsoft or Fabric provides a genuine path to resolving that. Not a perfect path, because it requires investment, planning, and sequencing, but a clear and proven one. And organizations that take it seriously and approach the transition with the right foundation and the right partner are emerging on the other side with a data capability that genuinely changes the way they do business. Prathamesh, I'll give you the final word on this.
Thank you, Arita. So I'll leave the viewers with these thoughts that I have. So organizations that are winning with data right now are not necessarily the ones with the largest data teams or most significant technology spend. They are the ones who have made a deliberate architectural choice to build a clear data or clear governed unified data foundation, and then build everything on top of it. That foundation is what Microsoft Fabric makes possible. But the decision to pursue this and the discipline to do this is extremely human, or I would say it's entirely human based, right? My encouragement to anyone watching this webinar would be, start the conversation internally, get an honest assessment of where your data estate actually is today, and understand the gap before you commit a step forward. The picture is almost always complex than it looks on the surface, and full of opportunity than the organizations initially expect. We would help you to navigate that.
Thank you. Thanks, Prathamesh. And thank you to everyone who's watched today. We hope this has been useful, and we genuinely look forward to continuing the conversation.